Ladies and gentlemen, we are now in a discussion of policy implementation. I will be specifically tasked to discuss to you on the process. The purpose of this presentation is to give you a glimpse on how does the policy being implemented. But before that, let us define first what is policy implementation all about. Policy implementation is the fourth phase of the policy cycle in which adopted policies are put into effect. It is also the process of moving an idea from concept to reality, from papers to execution. The word implementation itself is the building process rather than the design process. In general, policy implementation is the execution of the desired outcomes of the policy being formulated. But why is policy implementation important? Policy implementation is important because policies will not work if the process stops only at enactment. The essence of policy implementation is the conversion of the concept to actions, depending on the level of enactment from local to national and the type of policy from regulation to statute. But the question is, what are the process or how does the policy implemented? First, a policy needs to be communicated from the creator. The creator refers to any of the relevant governing body within the bureaucracy that has the power to enact, such as our local officials in the local government unit, including our House of Representatives, both lower and the upper house. A policy that was formulated would be passed down to law enforcement officials for implementation. For example, in the context here in Butuan City, the SP Ordinance number 6108-2020 entitled An Ordinance Mandating the Strict Implementation of the Mandatory General Curfew Hours in Butuan City to prevent the rise of COVID-19 cases, providing penalties therefore and for other purposes. So this kind of policy should be communicated from the governing body in order to effectively implement the provisions stated in this policy. Why there is a need to communicate from the one who crafted the policy? Because any of the existing agency or officials has the capabilities to carry out a given policy. They are capable enough to turn the concept into reality. By doing this, they hold accountable on the policy being implemented. Accountability is what really refers to this process. Second, policy needs to be communicated clearly and easy to interpret. In implementing the policy, everyone has to be clear on the goals, clear on its scope and limitations of the policy. Too much ambiguity in this stage can lead to involvement by the judiciary that will force legislators to clarify it to their ends. In implementing the policy, we have to provide adequate information, instruction, supervision to all of the stakeholders and should have considered that people have read, understood, and agree to comply the policies and procedures being implemented. Policy needs to be communicated clearly for us. The ordinary people can easily grasp on the desired outcomes. In this process, it will also ensure that policies being implemented, the provisions stipulated in the policy are realistic and actionable on a daily basis. The third process is that the resources applied for implementation must integrate with existing process and agencies. In implementing the policy, it will be complicated when policies are passed down to agencies without great deal of direction. If implementing policies does not integrate with existing processes and agencies, it would create extensive disruption, competition, or conflict. This is where coordination occurs between who put the policy into effect. It is important to note that there is really a need to coordinate with the one who crafted the policy and the one who will be affected on the implementation. On the above mentioned process, how do we know that we have successfully planned for policy implementation? First, always remember when you can say that this policy are effectively implemented when people involved in the implementation of the policy understands its very goals. For example, the Republic Act number 11479, known as the Anti-Terrorism Act of 2020, whose intent is to prevent, prohibit, and penalize terrorism in the Philippines. Do people really understand the very concept of that policy? Why there are a lot of petitions submitted to the Supreme Court questioning on the credibility of that law? That is how important should people understand what is really the goals or the desired outcomes of that policy. Second is that we have identified the inputs and resources used to implement the policy. And the third one is that we have documented the roles and responsibilities of those who are involved in the implementation of the policy. In conclusion to this presentation, it is important to note that it takes some time to fully implement a policy. There will be an intervention coming from the different groups of stakeholders. But by identifying the clear desired outcomes and by regularly monitoring on the implementation to be aware of any possible barriers, it would create a more effective and efficient policy being implemented. That's all. Thank you, and once again, good day.
Hi, I'm here to discuss the issues and challenges of policy implementation. Policy implementation is a process of moving an idea from concept to reality. There are at least 5 things that might get in our way. 1. Non-enforcement. 2. Coordination pitfalls. 3. Flaws in laws. 4. Stakeholders' cooperation. 5. Bureaucratic incompetence. Now, let's talk about these challenges one by one. 1. The non-enforcement. Law enforcement failure is one of the challenges in policy implementation. From simple traffic rules to laws against graft and corruption, offenders simply manage to get away with what they do, often without any punishment. In the Traffic and Transportation Code of Butuan City, where tricycles and pedicabs are not allowed in certain areas and public highways. But still, today, there are still tricycles and other motorcycle innovations that are even driving along the fast lane, and most often drivers who stay on their proper place on the road are the last ones to get through, and violators of the law often disregard the policies and laws because, again, they manage to get away with it. The second challenge is the coordination pitfalls. Effectively implementing policies calls the efficient coordination among government agencies at all levels, including the private sector, civil society, and development partners. The Philippines has actually been at the forefront of establishing coordination and consultative mechanisms to deal with sustainable development and other governance concerns. But coordination difficulties persist, particularly because governments have always been organized along distinct sectoral lines. Let's take disaster preparedness as an example. Coordination mechanisms among the different institutions involved are embedded in Republic Act 10121, known as the National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Law, that came into effect in 2009. Under this law, all provinces, cities, and municipalities must have their own counterpart, Local Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Council, within their respective jurisdictions. However, the extent to which local disaster management offices are well organized to act decisively on disaster preparedness programs would vary across different areas. These decisions would vary on factors such as authority and leadership, who is in charge during that disaster, the human behavior, their norms, the attitudes, and the values that may influence the coordination among stakeholders. The third challenge is the flaws in laws. Some of the difficulties of past years stem from inconsistencies and the ambiguities in the laws themselves. Among the most controversial bill that was signed into law by President Duterte is the Anti-Terrorism Act of 2020, which amends the 2007 Human Security Act that expands the definition of terrorism. President spokesperson Harry Roque said that terrorism, as we have often said, strikes anytime and anywhere. It is a crime against the people and humanity. Thus, the fight against terrorism requires a comprehensive approach to contain the terrorist threat. However, human rights advocates says otherwise, and that this law could lead to abuses and stifle free speech. Now that's where the conflict and petitions start to rise. The fourth challenge would be the stakeholders' cooperation. Public support is a fundamental factor in a successful policy implementation process. Policies to reach defined aims are well known and already documented. The main problem is their implementation. Not in terms of building a road or enacting a new law, but to convince the involved parties, mainly the citizens, and to gain their awareness and acceptance, as well as their willingness to support the new policy that is being implemented. Say, for example, the Republic Act 9003 or the Ecological Solid Waste Management Act of 2000, which provides the required policy framework, institutional mechanisms, and mandates the local government units to achieve 25% waste reduction target through establishing an integrated solid waste management plan based on the 3 R's, which is to reduce, reuse, and recycle. In line to this Republic Act, Butuan City Government has directed all barangays to strictly implement waste segregation and reduction at source. But the question lies between the gap of policy implementation between reality. Are we really segregating our solid waste at the home level? Are the people aware that they need to segregate their waste at the home level? Or are they really compliant to that policy? The fifth challenge would be the bureaucratic incompetence. Policy implementation can further be complicated when policies are passed down to agencies without a great deal of direction. Therefore, implementation imposes a large amount of discretion and as well as confusion in agencies that administer the policies. This happens when policies, systems, and procedures in an organization are not communicated well and implemented as it should be. They convey images known to us such as red tape, excessive rules and regulations, unimaginativeness, a lack of individual discretion, central control, and an absence of accountability. Those are the 5 issues and challenges on policy implementation in the Philippines.
In this part, I'm going to present the changes and development in policy implementation, the theories and approaches for policy development, and to cite some existing policies in the Philippine settings which undergone reforms and changes. Let's deal first with the concept of implementation, from the perspective of classical theory on the policy implementation and recent developments in this area. Classical implementation starts with the observation of implementation deficits. These deficits were traditionally demonstrated by comparing the products and real effects of a policy, which are the outputs and impacts or outcomes, and the substantive elements of policy that describe the policy objectives and instruments. Deficits are considered to be expression of a failure at the level of implementation, at not as raising questions about the intervention instruments and objectives formulated in the majority cases by policy actors. It should be noted that nowadays, the analytical concepts used in the implementation research have moved far beyond the mere adoption of formerly predominant doctrine of legislators and lawyers who considered implementation as purely executive or technical function. This old conception overestimated the capacity of the law to influence and control administration and its action with respect to the development of civil society. Apart from this external criticism, the researchers of implementation made significant changes to the initial conception of policy implementation, which arises to different approaches of policy implementation. For the purpose of this presentation, I will present four approaches in policy implementation. First approach is the top-down rational system approach. This involves scanning of a policy decision by statute, executive order, or court decision. Here, authoritative decisions are implemented to produce desired effects. Characteristics of top-down approaches are clear and consistent goals, articulated at the top of the hierarchical environment, knowledge of persistent cause and effect, clear hierarchy of authority, and establishment of rules at the top and alignment of policy with the rules and resources or capacity to carry out commands from the top. Second approach is the bottom-up rational approach. The school of thought believes that the target groups are actual implementers of policy. Calling to this view, local bureaucrats or implementers are allowed discretion in the implementation process with respect to local conditions for the success of policy. This may be a very good thing, especially when it uses expertise of people impacted by the policy to increase the likelihood of success and excellence. In the case of Philippine settings, the Department of Agriculture, under the provision of the Agriculture and Fisheries Modernization Act or AFMA, is mandated for the optimal use of extension approaches to attain national food security, sufficiency, and poverty alleviation. In response to this mandate, the School on the Air or SOA program is implemented as one of the strategies of agriculture extension. Comparing the two practices, the top-down approach with more simple and low-cost technologies might be more promising and feasible in the Philippine setting, while bottom-up farmer-first approach might be a step too far, because majority of the farmers in the Philippines are resource poor. Moreover, a combination of these two approaches or the hybrid can also be effectively used. The third approach is the inter-organizational interaction approach. Behavior of people with each other in an organization is important consideration for this aspect. According to this view, implementation is the process which involves interactions within organizations. Two approaches under this category are power dependency approach, in which interaction of organizations is a product of power relationships within two organizations. Such organizational relations are based on dominance and dependence. The second is organizational exchange approach, in which organizations work with one another for mutual benefit. The fourth and last approach is the policy action relationship model. It is an interactive and bargaining process takes over time between those who are responsible for enacting the policy and those who have the control resources. We are now done with the approaches in policy implementation for changes and development. Now let's proceed to reforms in the public policy in the Philippine setting. Policy change goes hand in hand with policy implementation. Passing policies does not necessarily mean that the desired outcomes are achieved. The government is now focused on delivering quality service that promotes good governance administration. The two major factors influence policy reforms are the public sector inefficiencies and liberal economic ideology. Some reforms in the Philippine public policy are the Sangguniang Kabataan or the SK and the Katipunan of Kabataan KK, with which were created through the Local Government Code of 1991, RA 7160, provides opportunity for young people to directly participate in local governance. On January 15, 2016, SK Reform Act of 2015 or RA 1742 was passed. It reinforces the role of youth participation in nation building, making them into better citizens with internalized values of patriotism, nationalism, and honor as a Filipino. Another law which was recently passed was RA 11479 or the Anti-Terrorism Act of 2020, which amends the Human Security Act of 2007. These are just some of the reforms in the Philippine settings. As a conclusion, even if these roles are clearly established, the implementation game itself always remains to be played. Furthermore, a number of implementation processes depends on the forms taken by interactions between actors of a particular policy who are relatively independent because they are organized on the basis of general institutional rules applicable to all public policies and or other concerns of a regional or local nature. The arrival of new piece of legislation may modify pre-existing policy networks. It should always be kept in mind that policies that create completely new activities and policy networks from scratch are rare. If not forging new path for itself, a recent policy must take account or integrate itself into existing organizational structures, procedures, and relationships between pre-existing actors. This is Desalin Pinaluga Pulmon in Changes and Development Process Improvements in the Policy Implementation.
According to Wilburrows, it is important to have a sound idea, but the really important thing is implementation.
According to Guy Kawasaki, organizations are successful because of good policy implementation and not just because of good business plans.
According to Jeffrey Pfeffer, successful organizations understand the importance of implementation, not just strategy, and moreover recognize the crucial role of their people in this process.
This is Group 3 on the discussion of policy implementation. Thank you.